a Jason Stapleton episode about a year and a half ago, and then I checked her out on her podcast, and I'm like, wow, she's really good. She really knows her stuff. It's a different perspective of things, because I'm not used to hearing anyone talk about the Constitution since Ron Paul. So now all of a sudden I have someone else I can listen to that talks about it, and she focuses on the federal government and what to do about it, and that's basically the focus of her show. She's a missionary, and I think she's also, and besides a constitutional attorney, and she travels around the country and talks about the Constitution and all different sorts of subjects. I saw her up in North Jersey last year talk about the First Amendment and religious freedom, and I was very impressed because not only was she calling out the so-called liberals, but the conservatives, they wanted their way too. I think KrisAnne said, well, when the other side gets power, they're going to use that power against you guys also. So that's why the First Amendment is meant for everybody, not just for a certain sect or religion or whatever else. So I like the fact that she seems right on the money and honest and right with what the Constitution, and which I think was meant to secure our rights. That's what the Constitution meant to do. So not to take them away. Anyway, I'm going to introduce KrisAnne All. Thanks for coming, KrisAnne.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
By the way, yeah, they were fire trucks. By the way, if you're interested in the religious liberty class, we're teaching that class tomorrow night in, where are we teaching that class?
That's going to be in St. Mary's Church in Barnegat.
Yeah, St. Mary's Church in Barnegat. So we'll be teaching that class tomorrow night. It's a very, very challenging class. It's probably one of the most challenging classes that I teach for Christians and non-Christians. It is not a class geared just for Christians, as some people might think. As a matter of fact, our framers believe very firmly that if the atheist doesn't have religious liberty, then neither does the Christian. And so we establish the fundamental foundations upon which this idea of religious liberty stems from. And it doesn't begin with Thomas Jefferson in 1802, by the way. So we take it back much further than that. Today's class, though, is on the Fourth Amendment. And I titled it Nothing to Hide, Everything to Preserve, because we're going to be learning a little bit about a person in history, and this was his perspective. And it's unfortunately the perspective that we must recapture in America, because we've allowed the federal government, primarily through the Supreme Court, to turn the Fourth Amendment into Swiss cheese through opinions and interpretations and definitions, for instance, of reasonableness. And so basically what these classes are based on history and based on what the men who created the Constitution actually intended, not what the Supreme Court says. And this is important for us to understand, because we have become a society of people who somehow believe now, in all walks of political life, that the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of everything constitutional. And that couldn't be any further from the truth or the intent of our framers. I am bringing this to you via PowerPoint on purpose, because people will tell you that understanding the Constitution, understanding the Fourth Amendment is something that's debatable, that it's controversial, that it's based on opinion. I don't want you to think that. I just want to show you simply by fact and by history and by the words of the men who wrote it themselves what it actually means and how it's supposed to work. So that way, if somebody disagrees with what I'm teaching you today, they're not disagreeing with my opinion. What they're disagreeing with is fact, history, and the words of the people who wrote it themselves. And I think those should be the three authorities on understanding anything that has to do with the Constitution. So what we need to understand, the role that history plays in understanding the Constitution. Patrick Henry said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that's the lamp of experience. I know no way of judging the future but by the past. There's a man named Solomon. Solomon said there is nothing new under the sun. Why? Because human nature never changes. We have a popular saying, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it, right? Only that's not true. See, history always repeats. And those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. I mean, wouldn't we all like to repeat the good stuff? Problem is that we've set aside history. We've declared history to be irrelevant to modern society, to be inapplicable, but in reality, it is who we are today. We're no different from a human nature perspective than we were back when we wrote the Constitution. This idea that our framers would have no idea what we would see today, so therefore what they wrote is irrelevant and needs a new modern interpretation is just absolutely ridiculous when you put forward the facts. How many of you listened to my radio show? All right, so how many of you heard the radio show today? So today's radio show, I showed you what Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 84 and how it directly calls out Hillary Clinton for her statement that everything in the Constitution is up for reasonable regulation. She has said that over and over again. Yes, she said, they are our rights, but all of our rights are subject to reasonable regulation. Those are her words. Now, first and foremost, that's a contradiction, right? Because if it's a right, it's not something you need to seek permission to exercise. And if you have to seek permission to exercise it, it's no longer a right. It's now a privilege bestowed upon you by government on the terms under which they want you to exercise it. So you can't say it's a right, but now we're going to regulate it, because that's a contradiction. And Alexander Hamilton, this is a completely different class, but listen to the radio show from today. Alexander Hamilton specifically calls out the very argument that Hillary Clinton is making today on why we cannot allow the government to define our liberty, because then we allow them to regulate it and take it from us. See, this history is so important. And the only way you can assert that the Constitution is a living, breathing document is if you extract all these facts and all this history from the document itself. So what we're going to do today is we're going to begin with the history that drove our framers to codify this Fourth Amendment. Then we're going to understand the basic principle of the Fourth Amendment, this understanding of property. One of my favorite things to do is to look up words that we use all the time. Because as we use words, we sort of dilute their meanings. And we don't even realize it. For example, if I told you that I am here to encourage you, you might get a vision of a cheerleader in your mind. Only if you look up that word encourage in the dictionary, it means to infuse with courage. Now, my undergraduate degree is in biochemistry, so I know that if you infuse something, you saturate it to its very cellular level. So when I tell you I'm here to encourage you, which I hope that I am, what I mean is I am here to saturate you to the very cellular level with the courage necessary to defend your rights. A little bit more than a cheerleader, isn't it? That's why getting back to basics in education is so important, because we have failed to teach the right things for so very long. Let me introduce you to this man. His name is James Otis Jr. James Otis Jr. is important to this bit of history because James Otis Jr., the founders of our constitutional republic, referred to James Otis Jr. as the midwife to liberty. See, our liberty movement didn't begin with the Boston Tea Party in 1773. It didn't begin with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, our liberty movement, the tangible portion of it, began with this man in February of 1761. Now, the first thing that we must lay is the background. Unfortunately, we have to lay the background for our battle for independence. Because we are actually teaching in our schools that our battle for independence was sparked because the colonists were upset, or I'm sorry, not even the colonists, the Americans were upset because the British people were taxing their tea. Our independence movement was not about taxes, okay? Go read the Declaration of Independence and you will see that you have to get to the 17th grievance against the king before you see any mention of taxes. So in reality, let's just do a sort of a big picture, and we'll go back and hit the details. The big picture is our independence movement from Great Britain. Mind you, we were all British at that time, right? We know that, but our kids don't know that. Because as I teach across the country, I teach young people too, and I ask them, who fought in the Revolutionary War? And they tell me, the Americans and the British. Only there were no Americans in the Revolutionary War. They were British people fighting their own government. Because in spite of what we teach, and quite ironically, in spite of what the British people are taught about their history as well, our framers had a constitution. The British government had a constitution. Theirs was built of 5 documents they called Liberty Charters. You read the framers' writings, and they refer to their constitutions over and over and over again. And inside those constitutions were guaranteed rights of all Englishmen. And what was happening was the British government was denying the American colonists, who were Englishmen, their guaranteed rights. First and foremost, their right to representative government. They had a right to be represented in government for the creation of laws. And that right had been codified back in 1215. It actually started back before 1100, but it was codified in 1215. So the American colonists were getting very aggravated at the British government passing all of these laws on the island to be enforced on the continent. But you see, they had no representation, so Parliament didn't care how upset they were. So the colonists are pushing back. They're saying, look, all these laws that you keep creating on us here in the continent, while you're over there on the island. You see, if we have no representation, then how are our interests heard? This is a violation of our liberty. Parliament disagreed. You know, they made all kinds of excuses. Well, you know, the distance that it would take, that we exist from the American colonies, and the time that it would take to get a representative there. And what if something happens to your representative, the time that it would take to replace them? All these excuses. And you don't need to worry about it, they said. Because after all, we have people in Parliament who have volunteered to represent your interests. The colonists were like, seriously? If you're over there making laws to be enforced over here, and you never have to come over here and live under the laws that you create, then you don't represent us. You only represent your own interests. See, isn't that a bit of history that we should be teaching in America? A little lesson from history that when the people who make the laws and enforce the laws are not bound by the laws that they make, they don't represent us, right? They're only representing themselves and their own special interests. Well, Parliament is not hearing the pleas of the American colonists. They're not giving them representation. Now, they have another problem that's happening about the same time. Great Britain has gone into debt defending the American colonies in the French and Indian War. Now, they need to recoup that debt, so they start passing on the American colonists consumption taxes, you know, like a sales tax. And they want to make sure that they quickly can get their money, so they don't tax just anything. They tax the very important things, the things that the people have to have: linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink. Now, of those 6 things that we've mentioned that are specifically taxed in this consumption tax, linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink, what do you suppose was the most offensive taxation in the eyes of our American colonists? And I'll give you a hint, it wasn't tea.
Liquor?
Nope, not liquor.
Ink, sugar.
Who said ink? It's ink and paper. Ink and paper. Now, it wasn't a freedom of press issue. No, it was a due process issue. You see, our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments were not invented by our framers. They were inherited from the Magna Carta. Clauses 38 through 40 is where we get our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments. Sometimes even the very language itself, the very verbiage. And so they knew that they had a right to due process. And when you have a right to something, it's not something you have to meet conditions of in order to exercise, grant permissions to exercise. And they said, look, we have a right to due process. And if we have to pay the government a fee, a tax fee, for paper and ink, then we no longer have a right to due process. We have a privilege. Because you see, in order to engage in due process, you have to file documents with the court. And if I have to pay the government for ink and paper before I can file anything in the court, then I do not have a right to due process. That is something that the government establishes conditions and permissions upon. I want that to sort of settle in a little bit. How many of you heard something called filing fees? If you have to pay the court for the privilege of filing a document, do you have a right to due process? Absolutely not. And this was a catalyst for our framers to step up and say, you know what? We're not paying this tax. We're going to stop. And they start this sort of underground movement. Now, in the midst of this, Great Britain passes a law called writs of assistance. Now, the writs of assistance were what we would classify today as handwritten warrants, very literally. And a customs agent or a tax collector standing on your front porch with a blank sheet of paper and a quill. Colonist Smith, by the authority vested in me, by the power of the king, I will now search and seize, signed me. Now, they're supposed to be searching and seizing to make sure you're buying the stuff. Because, right, the British government's got this brilliant idea. We can maximize our revenue from these consumption taxes by mandating that the colonists purchase the taxed items. So in order to mandate that they purchase the taxed items, we're going to have to search their homes to make sure they're buying the stuff they're supposed to be buying. Well, the colonists weren't saying, sure, come on in. Well, many of them were, but some were not. And so they passed these writs of assistance that allowed the customs agents and the tax collectors to search and seize in the homes and the businesses to ensure that the colonists were buying the mandated items. Now, here's the problem. Our right to be secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures is not an invention. It's an inheritance. Our American colonists, as British subjects, had the right to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. They had a right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. That is in the Magna Carta. This due process right. And so now you have customs agents acting by the color of law, violating a codified right. Completely arbitrary too, right? Because where's the due process when the officer writes out the warrant and serves it for you right there in front of you? How many of you see this is complete and total arbitrary power? Now let me ask you something. How many wicked people have to exercise arbitrary power before the power becomes wicked itself?
Zero. It was wicked from the day
Right.
created.
But they just one, right? Just one. Now let me ask you a question. Given human nature, how many of us realize that wicked people gravitate to arbitrary power?
Yep.
So now you have an arbitrary power under the color of law through the force of government being exercised by men who are not of high moral character. So let's just let this out here. Because you see, although they were searching and seizing for linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink, they were doing it for their own personal gain in many cases. I got a grudge on my neighbor and I'm a tax collector. Ha-ha, I know what I'm going to do. My best friend has a business and his competitor has just gotten an edge up. What am I going to do? So now we have people using this power for their own personal gain. And let's just, since well, I'll speak over the young ears here. They weren't just searching and seizing linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink. They were searching and seizing our wives and daughters. This is a bit of history we don't teach because historians have a tendency to sort of clean up history so we don't have to see the dirty stuff. But remember, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat its mistakes. And every time we clean up history, we doom ourselves to being that stupid again. And here we go, right? I mean, is any of this ringing any modern day bells for us out there? Well, here's where James Otis Jr. comes in. Because James Otis Jr. was an attorney who had received the highest post any attorney could receive from the king. It was his job to enforce the laws of the crown and ensure proper prosecution of the people who have violated those laws. But Otis is having an internal conflict. Because you see, he's an attorney. He was raised by an attorney. He's a father's attorney. Now, he's not only knows the British law, but he was also raised in the British Liberty Charters, their constitution. And so now Otis is feeling conflicted by the job that the government wants him to perform and his understanding and knowledge of the rights and the liberties of the people. So this government employee who is being told to violate the privacy and the property of the people knows that this is a violation of their constitution and he can't do it anymore. So he resigns his post. Now, Otis could have just gone back to practicing law, quietly and lived his life, but that's not who he was. Otis became a whistleblower. He began publishing what the government was doing to the people, educating them again on their rights and their liberties, because people have a tendency over time to forget about their rights and to lose understanding of liberty. He starts writing letters in the newspapers. He starts talking to everybody he can, teaching people how the government was violating their liberty. I mean, does that sound familiar to us? We wouldn't know any former government employees who are exposing the government's violation of our privacy and our property, would we?
William Beatty.
I mean, seriously. Snowden is not an enemy of the state. Snowden has exposed what our government was doing the same way that Otis was exposing what his government was doing in the exact same way. You want to get mad that secrets are being released? Get mad at the government for keeping them. Don't get mad at the guy who has exposed them. Think about where would we be today if Snowden hadn't told us what the government is doing behind our backs? What kind of questions would we be asking? We wouldn't be asking any at all. I don't know if you saw this, but a year or so ago, the Wall Street Journal did a Freedom of Information Act request on the Department of Justice. And based on that report, they found out that the Department of Justice has been taking pictures of the license plates of our vehicles, of the drivers and the passengers of our vehicles as we drive down the road. And they've been taking these pictures and storing them up in their own words for future use since 2008. Now, if you'd gone to your next door neighbor in 2008 and said, hey, did you know the federal government is taking pictures of us as we're driving down the road and storing them up for future use, what would your neighbor have told you in 2008? You're crazy. But now we have the Department of Justice admitting that's exactly what they are doing right now. Doesn't that sort of beg the question what they're doing that they're not telling us? And how would we even know that if someone hadn't exposed the violations of our liberties? Now, Otis wasn't any better received in his community than Snowden is. As a matter of fact, he was called outcast by his people in his community, called every name in the book but a good Christian man. He was told by others in the legal profession that if you don't shut up, we'll never let you practice law in the entire kingdom again. But it's getting really bad. People are losing everything through these searches and seizures. So finally, two businessmen come to Otis. And they say to Otis, look, you're the only guy who's willing to stand up and say something. We have this agent who is a total tyrant, and we are about to lose everything. Will you help us bring a legal case against this agent? Otis says, Okay, I will. The interesting thing is, the minute Otis files this complaint against the government agent, the Crown conveniently forgets that Otis has resigned his original post and charges him with abandoning his post, which is treason, which means now he can be shot on sight. Now let's just remember, this is February of 1761. There are no Sons of Liberty, no committees of correspondence. Of course, there's George Washington, Samuel Adams, Dr. Warren, Patrick Henry. And the people know them. But not as defenders of liberty, but as people in their community. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Franklin is still writing letters under pseudonyms because you don't want anybody to know what you think about the government violating your rights. So now Otis has made a public stand. And his life, his reputation, his entire livelihood is on the line. Now think about this. It is February of 1761. Otis is standing before the courtroom doors with his clients. It's time to go in and argue the case. He has practically no support in the community. Well, of course he's got friends. Hey, Otis, we really appreciate what you're doing, man. We love, and I'm so glad how you're educating the people in the stand that you're taking. You're so brave. We just admire you so much for what you're doing. I mean, I can't do that, because I might lose my job or my family members. They wouldn't understand. But I really appreciate, we got to have more people like you, Otis. Just not me, right? I mean, those kind of people.
The hell, I am one.
So look, what do? Otis is standing there. The court of public opinion is not going to be behind him. The court of the Crown is certainly not going to be in his favor. And he knows as soon as he opens those doors and steps inside, he is submitting himself to the jurisdiction of the Crown. They could be waiting there for him with shackles because he's been charged with treason. There'll be no court date. He's just simply arrested and he's hung the next day. Now, the reason I want you to think about this, because I know history repeats. And I teach over 265 classes in over 22 states every single year to groups like this. I know that there will be people that I have taught, at least in the last 6 years, if not in the last 6 months, who are going to have to come to an Otis decision in their life. And the thing that's going to happen is you're going to say, well, if I take this stand and they throw me in prison or they take my house, what difference have I made? I mean, nobody's going to care. Who's going to come to my defense? I'm rotting in prison. My family don't have me, they don't have a home. Why should I take this stand? Wouldn't you think that'd be the same thing that Otis is thinking at this time? Why should I take this stand? If I step in that courtroom, not only will I lose my ability to practice law ever, my reputation is completely gone, and I might even be hung. Couldn't he just very well look at his clients and say, you know what, let's file a continuance today, and then we'll start really hitting the streets, we'll get our favor in the court of the public opinion, and then the Crown maybe not so quick to, hang us. Can we all agree that might be a reasonable consideration?
Perhaps.
So what do? Well, Otis walks in that door. He argues for over 5 hours on how these writs of assistance are the worst instruments of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty ever found in an English law book, he says. And in his argument before the court, he says, I can sincerely declare that I cheerfully submit myself to every odious name for conscience sake. And from my soul I despise all those whose guilt, malice, or folly has made them my foes. Let consequences be as they will. I am determined to proceed. You can hang me. You can take my ability to live, you can take my home, you can take my reputation, but my liberty is worth more than all of that. That's what he's saying. I love this part. And from my soul I despise all those whose guilt, malice, or folly has made them my foes. Can we just pause for that a second and think about this? How many of you believe there are people in government who are destroying our liberty because they're ignorant and they don't know any better? Okay? I mean, that's reasonable. How many of you believe that there are people in government who are destroying our liberty because they're wicked, they know exactly what they're doing, and they want to? Exactly. So let me ask you this question. At the end of the day, what difference does it make? Because the result is exactly the same. See, we got to change the way we think about liberty and stop re-electing these people who are just destroying our liberty because they don't know any better, and we like them because they're good guys. Oh, he goes to my church. He's part of my Rotary. We have coffee together at the shop. He really means well. Otis says it doesn't matter if he means well. He is your foe. Why do we keep electing our foes to defend our liberty? Because we've got the wrong perspective on liberty. Now here's the bad news of the whole story. Otis argues for 5 solid hours, and the court doesn't even give him an opinion. We've heard the argument of Otis and his clients. We've considered the law of the crown, and we'll take the matter under advisement. When taking the matter under advisement, you know what that means? That means the law stays exactly the same. Nothing changes. So the searches and seizures are happening. Otis has put everything on the line, and nothing has changed. You're probably thinking, wow, KrisAnne, why are you telling us this story? This is a really crappy story. How is this going to motivate me? It should motivate you. Because I really believe we are going to make this decision. And as we're considering whether we walk through those doors or not, we got to consider one thing. See, it's not about you. It's about something bigger. Because even though Otis walked in that courtroom alone, what he found when he got inside was something completely different. You see, that courtroom that day, February 1761, was packed out. Now, mind you, I'm sure there was your group of people, the gawkers, the drama seekers, right? Let's go see Otis get hung and see what happens, right? But in reality, there was a large crowd of people there who had been feeling the undertones of liberty, had become awakened to what the government is doing by the means of Otis and maybe the letters of Silence Dogood and those who are actually speaking about these things in the dark corners. And they wanted to see what was going to happen. And it wasn't just anybody in that courtroom. In that courtroom that day was Samuel Adams, John Adams, Dr. James Warren. The men who would become this liberty movement sat there and watched Otis that day, and this was such an important day in our history that John Adams would write about it 40 years later. Adams said about Otis in February of 1761, he says, "But Otis was a flame of fire, with a promptitude of classical allusions, a depth of research, a rapid summary of historical events and dates, a profusion of legal authorities, a prophetic glare of the future in his eyes, and a rapid torrent of impetuous eloquence. He hurried away all before him." Adams said, "American independence was then and there born. The seeds of patriots and heroes to defend the vigorous youth were then and there sown." He said, "Every man of this immense crowded audience appeared to me to go away as I did, ready to pick up arms against these writs of assistance." Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, February 1761, then and there, the child of independence was born. And in 15 years, Adams said, namely in 1776, that child grew up to manhood and declared himself free. See, why do you take the stand? Not about your comfort, not even about your victory, because it's about who's watching. Who's watching? Who's going to be John Adams? Who's going to be Samuel Adams? Who's going to be Dr. Warren? Who's going to be Patrick Henry? You have no idea the impact you will make with one stand, even though you think nobody's watching. That's why this is inspirational. Because from that courtroom that day, Samuel Adams and Dr. James Warren left so supercharged that they started the committees of correspondence. From the committees of correspondence, birthed the Sons of Liberty, birthed the Liberty Women from Edenton, North Carolina. The entire liberty movement, because one man said, "Let consequences be what they will, I am determined to proceed." One man changed the whole world with one event. And what was it all about? It was all about the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Why don't we see that kind of passion in America today? Why don't we see people ready to take that kind of stand, knowing that the federal government and your local government are reading your emails and listening to your phone conversations, storing up your data, taking pictures of you as you drive down the street? My goodness. We've got Julian Assange being threatened with assassination for releasing Hillary Clinton's emails, and we're supposed to be okay with the federal government reading ours? Why? Because we've lost attachment with the value of our persons, houses, papers, and effects. We've lost the meaning of the word property. James Madison wrote an essay called Property in 1792, where he goes into detail to tell us the meaning of property. And just like we talked about in Courage, it is so much deeper than your cell phone, so much deeper than your car, so much deeper than where you stomp your feet and hang your hat. Madison said this term, property, in its particular application, means that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other individual. Property. But in its larger and juster meaning, it embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right. In the former sense, the property sense, a man's land, merchandise, or money is called his property. Man, how have we lost the attachment to our own money? Right? It's no longer our property anymore. It's all government revenue. They just allow us to keep a portion of it so we can funnel it back to them eventually, right? But look what he says. In the latter sense, that broader, that more juster meaning, a man has a property in his opinions and the free communication of them. He has a property of particular value in his religious opinions and in the profession and practice dictated by them. Wow, that's like the First Amendment, isn't it? What James Madison is trying to explain to us is your First Amendment, your freedom of speech, your freedom of press, your right to peaceably assemble, your right to petition the government for a redress of your grievances, your right to freedom of religion. Those are all property. They're not ideals. They're not floating around in the ether. They're not subject to interpretation. They are physical, tangible property. He says he has a property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person. Your right to keep and bear arms is a property. And that's not even referring to your guns. Obviously, the guns are physical property, but in a broader and a juster sense, the very right to self-preservation is a property. He says he has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and the free choice of the objects on which to employ them. Intellectual property. You have a property in the freedom of your expression of your ideas and your beliefs. Can we just stop and consider that for just one moment? This broader and juster meaning that Madison is really trying to drive home here. Let me give you an analogy. Everybody knows that when you, I say this very loosely, purchase property, right? Everybody knows we don't own property in America anymore, right?
Yeah.
You simply lease it from the government.
Right.
Right. You, at very best, if you have your property with no mortgage, you are still a fee tenant to the government. Because you failed to pay your property taxes for 3 years, you see who owns your property, right?
I see who steals it from you.
Well,
I won't say that they own.
They will not. They will seize your property for 3 years of back taxes. Those 3 years of back taxes are not the value of your property, which proves they're not purchasing your property from you. They're not buying it from you. They're evicting you from their property because you have failed to pay the proper government rent. So let's just look at it from this perspective. You have purchased a piece of property, and when you purchase that piece of property, there's a survey, right? The survey is stored in the property appraiser's office. The survey dictates the very boundaries of your property by measurement, exact measurement. What if 3 government agents came to your door with a clipboard and said, "We have a copy of the survey of your property, and we want to show you what we're going to do for you. See, you must recognize that the survey of your property was completed 30, 40 years ago. And we're a completely different society now than we were 30, 40 years ago, right? We have different technologies, we have different needs, we have different security issues now than we did 30, 40 years ago. So what we're going to do for you is we're going to reinterpret your property lines in 2 feet on all sides. Now, we're not actually changing your property lines. We're just going to reinterpret them in 2 feet on all sides. Now, 2 feet of property, you're not going to miss that. Nobody's going to miss that. It's just a minor imposition. And don't worry, it's not discriminatory because everybody's going to have their property redefined by 2 feet. But look at the benefit. You see, now we have a 4-foot buffer between all property in which we can provide you with greater services and greater security. How many of you are going to sign on the dotted line? All right, let me ask it this way. How many are going to be willing to stand up and fight for 2 feet of property? So what Madison's saying is if you would pick up a fight for 2 feet of your land, how do we sit idly by while the very same government redefines freedom of speech and redefines the property of your right to keep and bear arms? How do we sit back and let this happen and not say anything? Because we've lost attachment to this understanding of property. And the Fourth Amendment was established to remind the people to never lose that attachment. Now here's the problem. Because we've lost this attachment, because we've lost our understanding of why we have the Fourth Amendment and the purpose of the Bill of Rights, and we've stopped studying grammar in schools, we no longer understand the Fourth Amendment. And we are allowing the oligarchy of 9 kings and queens to tell us what this means, as if we're too stupid to read it for ourselves. Because, you know, government is really good at one thing: reading only what they want to see. So this is the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Now, the government stops reading there. And they say, you realize that you are not free from all searches and seizures. You are only free from unreasonable ones. But what is unreasonable? So you see, then the court has to get together and define what a reasonable man would define as reasonableness so that we are not unreasonably searched and seized. Problem is, we don't need the court courts or the government to define reasonableness, the Fourth Amendment has already done that. Because it says, and no warrant shall issue but based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now, something that we don't study very often in layman's terms is the understanding of law. And in the legal documents, sometimes the little words have the most power. And the most powerful word in the Fourth Amendment is this one. And. That word and is not or. And or do not mean the same thing, right? And by putting the word and there, that means that all 5 conditions must be met at the same time in order to have a reasonable search and seizure. The Fourth Amendment defines reasonableness for us. A reasonable search and seizure must have 5 elements, or it is now unreasonable. All searches and seizures, in order to be reasonable, must have a warrant based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And not 4 out of 5, not 3 out of 5, not 3.5 out of 5. All 5 have to be present. We don't need the Supreme Court because the Fourth Amendment already defines reasonableness for us. Why would they go through all this trouble? Because they lived arbitrary power. They lived arbitrary searches and seizures. And remember, they wanted to secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity, that's you and me. So they wanted to make sure that government agents could never wield arbitrary power, because the people would be educated and the people would know that anything beyond these terms are simply unreasonable. But because we have failed to teach the right things for so long, what do we have? We have a Department of Non-Justice, an organized band of criminals. Yes?
What's oath or affirmation?
That means due process. Subject to oath or affirmation, meaning you can challenge that in a court. Somebody has stood before a judge, and I swear and affirm that the conditions of these warrants are true by my name, by reputation, under penalties of perjury.
I thought that's what warrant meant.
No, that's the paper in writing.
Okay.
Okay, so the warrant has to be affirmed before the court for its veracity, and you must be able to challenge that, the oath or affirmation, in order to have proper due process. Very good question. Thank you. I usually cover that, but I missed it. But now we have the Department of Justice, right? And we have national security letters and suspicious activity reports. What are those things?
Hearsay.
I mean, this is national security letters and the suspicious activity reports are what we got from George Bush when the towers fell through the Patriot Act. So it's very popular today to point fingers at Barack Obama, but the truth is George Bush destroyed our Fourth Amendment before Barack Obama ever even hit the stage. And he did it to keep us safe from Al-Qaeda terrorists. That was the whole premise for the Patriot Act. We must keep you safe from Al-Qaeda terrorists. And so, in other words, we have to be able to search and seize without proper warrants so that the Al-Qaeda terrorists can't kill you. But look what happens. In 2006, the Government Accountability Office did an audit on these national security letters. Who was president in 2006?
Bush.
Just making sure it wasn't Obama. Okay? So this is not Obama's fault. So in 2006, according to the Government Accountability Office, 49,000 of these national security letters were issued in just 1 year, with 60% being served on U.S. citizens and legal resident aliens. See, I thought these national security letters were supposed to keep us safe from Al-Qaeda terrorists. Are we now supposed to believe that 60% of our Al-Qaeda terrorist threat comes from people like you and me? Well, that's what the government is asserting, isn't it? Not only that, how many of you remember the big hoo-ha about the Patriot Act expiring? Did you see that? Okay, that's a lie. The Patriot Act did not expire.
For one day.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't even the whole Patriot Act that expired, right? It was only Section 215 of the Patriot Act that expired. The interesting thing is, Section 215 changes the Fourth Amendment from the requirement of probable cause to mere relevance. So when the Section 215 required, mere relevance is not even close to probable cause, so it doesn't meet the conditions of the Fourth Amendment. But when Section 215 expired, guess what? There was no standard. How did that work out for them? And then we had to let it expire so we would be safer. No. We need some politicians with some political fortitude and backbone and a constitutional knowledge and conviction that will get rid of the national security letters. Completely get rid of the Patriot Act. You know, the interesting thing is, most people don't know this, the Patriot Act was supposed to be dissolved when George Bush left office. That was the terms under which it was passed. The only way Congress would pass the Patriot Act in 2001 is if it had a provision in it that said that the act would sunset when George Bush leaves office. How's that working out for us? 49,000 national security letters served on 60% U.S. citizens. The suspicious activity reports. They're a subsidiary of the national security letters. They're warrantless searches on businesses. And in this audit in 2006, the Government Accountability Office found that over 200,000 suspicious activity reports were served on banks alone, seizing over 2 million bank records. Now here's the real kicker. National security letters and suspicious activity reports, they carry a gag order, which means if you're served with one, you can't tell anybody. And the government has even said you can't even consult an attorney for advice on your warrant if they have deemed it to be a matter of national security. So with 200,000 warrants being served on banks, seizing over 2 million bank records, you probably know somebody who's had their bank records seized, but they will never know it because the bank can never tell them.
Same thing with ISPs.
I love this. I'm absolutely convinced that the Captain America movies are created by libertarians. He says, this isn't freedom. We're holding a gun to every citizen's head and calling it security. The Fourth Amendment was supposed to remind us to never let government agents have arbitrary power like that. And yet, where are we? So what is the solution? Because here's the key. Electing a presidential messiah is not going to fix this. First off, there's no such thing as a presidential messiah. Second off, there's not a constitutional candidate running. And I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings, but I have studied all the platforms. There's not a single presidential platform in 6 presidential candidates that actually addresses real constitutional presidential power. And because we have devolved into a 2-party system, and people are afraid to elect real candidates, it's very likely that one of 2 people are going to be president. I don't mean to dash anybody's hopes, but it's just crazy. How many of you follow me on Facebook? Anybody see my post on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy #4?
Oh, I shared it.
Yeah. Wasn't that awesome?
The lizard.
The lizard, yeah. So how many are familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? So it's a British series, a trilogy of 5 books. That's a joke. Anyway, it's about an Englishman who goes off into space, and his best friend's an alien named Ford. And they're talking about this people that they've come about, and Ford says these people have, they come from an old democracy, an old tradition of democracy, where they elect lizards to be their leaders. And Arthur says, why would they elect lizards? He says, that's just what they do. Ford says, the people don't really like the lizards, but they've always been electing lizards, so that's what they do. Arthur says, but I thought they were a democracy. Why don't they just stop voting for the lizards? Ford says, well, because if they don't vote for a lizard, then the wrong lizard might get in office. Isn't that where we are today? Now that we've devolved into a two-party system, we've got to vote the lesser of evils because the wrong evil might get elected. You see what happens when we vote the lesser of evils? You're always getting evil. And the status quo will never change until we actually change it. So what do we have to do? The federal government's not going to fix itself. As a matter of fact, in my humble opinion, I think that if we simply ignored federal elections for the next 6 years, we would only get better, not worse. Federal politicians don't listen to us anyway. And all the changes that we have to make are in the state and local governments because that is where all your power is. The constitutional republic was established so the state and local governments actually have more power than the federal government. And your state and local governments have the authority to look the federal government in the face and say, you know what? What you're doing is unconstitutional, so we will not comply. And that's the solution. Let me show you how this works. Anybody ever heard of this guy? His name is Brad Rogers. Brad Rogers is a sheriff in Elkhart County, Indiana. Brad Rogers got so sick and tired of the FDA and the USDA raiding his Amish farmers, you know, over those weapons of mass destruction called raw milk and cheese, that he wrote a letter to the USDA. It told them to explain, to share his letter with their FDA friends, and told them, if you come in my county again without first seeking my permission, I will arrest you. A sheriff telling the federal government, you have no authority here. And that's the way it's supposed to work. As a matter of fact, that's exactly even what the Supreme Court says. In a Supreme Court opinion called Mac Prins v. U.S., the Supreme Court said, the federal government and the local governments have distinct and different jurisdictions that do not meet. And your sheriff does not have to comply with federal laws because that's not his jurisdiction. Isn't that crazy?
Perfect.
They were calling Brad Rogers a hero. He says, I'm not a hero. I'm just doing what everybody ought to be doing. I'm just doing my job. Look at that. Your local elected officials can stem the tide of federal overreach if they apply just a little backbone in supporting and defending the Constitution. Didn't they take an oath to that? He says, expect it, demand it. Some bloggers and natural food writers have hailed me as a hero. I'm no hero, I'm just doing my job. And whether you're a conservative or a liberal, I will be a guardian of the Constitution for you, and I will not stand idly by while the rights of citizens of my county are trampled, whether by criminals or an overreaching government. Because in reality, the overreaching government are criminals, because they're violating the supreme law of the land. This is another sheriff, and I need to write down his name because I forget. I think this is in Wyoming. He says, we're not taking no more cuts on the mountain. I'll deputize every man, woman, and child in the county to stop what's going on. Standing up against the Bureau of Land Management and the Federal Forestry Service. And guess what? They've had no more problems. As a matter of fact, I just saw Brad Rogers the other day. I was just teaching in Indiana. He came to one of my classes. And even to this day, he has never had another problem with the FDA or the USDA. What does this prove to us? The federal government is nothing but a big schoolyard bully, all bark and no bite. Because the truth of the matter is, they have us brainwashed into submission. They do not have the manpower or the resources to enforce all their rules and regulations. You see, they rely on co-opting the state and local governments to do the bidding for them. And when we refuse, they have no power. Why? Because regardless of what they tell you, we still outnumber them. Big Brother is watching you. So what do we need to do about that? Emails, phone calls, internet activity, metadata collection. The feds demand backdoor access to cell phone data without a warrant. How is that a warrant based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized?
Well, it is if the government considers you all an enemy.
Well, but that's not there is no enemy exception in the Fourth Amendment. It does not say unless you are an enemy of the state. It doesn't say unless it's a matter of national security. There is only one exception to your security of your property. Only one. And 5 things must be present at the same time to meet that one exception. So let's think about this now. Let's wrap this all up. Let's tie this all together. Remember what Madison said about property. Persons, houses, papers, and effects. What would be your effects? Your right to freedom of speech. Your property and your right to freedom of speech. Freedom of religion. Freedom of press. To peaceably assemble. To petition the government for a redress of your grievances. The property and your right to be secure in your persons, houses, papers, and effects. Isn't that crazy? Your right to be secure in your property is a property in and of itself. Your property and your right to defend yourself from enemies, foreign and domestic. A property. But think about this. When every word is being monitored and recorded, and collected and stored up for future use, do you have freedom of speech?
There is a temporary workaround. There is a technological workaround for the 3 things you mentioned: internet, emails, and phone calls.
Yeah, that is absolutely offensive.
It's like sending a postcard, though.
It's absolutely offensive
Do you
that
think
we
you
have
privacy
to
if you
try
send someone a
to
postcard?
secure our rights by circumventing the government's oppression of them. Because we have lost touch with what our property is. Let's think about this. Roadside checkpoints. Safety, officer safety. Exigent circumstances. Where is that as an exception to your right to your property? This is what Alina Kagan said. Blowing is a search. There's no question about that. But there are searches, and then again, there are searches. There are more invasive searches and less invasive searches. So not only are we in government equivocating the meaning of property, we're now equivocating the meaning of reasonableness, we're equivocating the meaning of searches. Where in the Fourth Amendment does it say that some searches are okay if they're not invasive? And this is what happens when we allow government to define our liberties. How many of you heard of constitution-free zones?
That's where I live.
Look, this is my house right there. That is my house right there. Federal courts have said that a 100-mile boundary around the United States for national security purposes is a constitution-free zone, which means the federal government is not bound by the Constitution in this 100-mile radius for national security interests. Here's the problem. My whole state does not exist in the constitutional republic anymore. What does that make the state of Florida? It makes the state of Florida not a state. It makes it a colony of the federal government.
Is that a decision or a statement?
Those are federal opinions. That hasn't made it to the Supreme Court. Nobody will challenge this to the Supreme Court until they're certain they have justices that will uphold it. And nobody else can afford to do it. Right?
Who made the state an opinion?
It's different federal jurisdictions. Isn't that crazy? Look at that. Where are you? I mean, you guys live in a colony too. Yeah, I forgot I'm in New Jersey, right? Holy cow. Practically all the East Coast is nothing but a colony anymore.
Almost all of Pennsylvania.
How crazy is that? Everything that our founders went through on the East to become free and independent states only by the oligarchy of kings and queens to be determined to be a colony once again.
That map covers 90% of the population.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. By the way, this map was compiled by the ACLU. people have problems with the ACLU. Here's the thing. Quite often, they're on the right side of liberty. Not for the right reasons, but still, liberty. Look at what Madison says in his essay on property. That is not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and his personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest. A magistrate issuing his warrants to a press gang would be in his proper function in Turkey or Indostan under appellations proverbial of the most complete despotism. Madison is describing the condition of our federal government as being nothing but hired mercenaries operating under conditions of complete despotism. And what he wants us to realize is that when the government has this power, this unlimited, uncontrolled authority to search and seize our property for the benefit of someone else, then all of your property, even those properties that you have in your rights, are not secure. Think about this from the Western states' perspective. We have farmers and ranchers who will not criticize the federal government in any way, shape, or form because they're afraid of losing their permit to operate on their own land. They have to pay the Bureau of Land Management fees to use their own land. Because this is what the Bureau of Land Management looks like now. We didn't even look like that in Benghazi. And this is what the Bureau of Land Management looks like when they want to collect grazing fees. This is not a just government, America. And we'd better wake up and realize the condition upon which we live in. Because if you don't have a right to your property, you are a slave. What about the Food Safety Modernization Act? Anybody heard of that one? This was actually passed by our conservative majority in the Congress in 2012, which put a 10-governmental agency committee in charge of keeping our food manufacturing safe from terrorist attacks. The FDA, the USDA, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and 6 other agencies, the EPA, are now in charge of keeping our food manufacturers safe from terrorist attacks. Because you see, think about that. If the terrorists could get into Monsanto, if the terrorists could get into the Chiquita banana, or Dole, or Kraft, and plant some kind of terrorist material, that would be terrible, wouldn't it?
Too late.
So now we have to have the federal government have the authority to regulate large food manufacturing facilities to keep us safe from terrorist attacks. Here's the problem. Not only did they include large food manufacturing companies, they also included in the language of this bill something called very small farms. What do you think a very small farm is?
Amish farms?
Your garden.
Somebody in your backyard.
Well, guess what?
Gardens.
Congress didn't define it in the bill. Since they didn't define very small farms in the bill, you know what that means? That means the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, and these agencies now get to define very small farms. How do you think they're going to define that?
10 different ways.
Well, let's think about that. The EPA has defined navigable waters as any puddle that sits more than 90 days. Under the Clean Water Act, that is now a navigable water. How do you think they're going to define a very small farm? Not only that, they have also included farmers markets and roadside fruit stands. And here's the kicker. After they passed the bill under the guise of keeping us safe from terrorist attacks on our large food manufacturers, they issued waivers to most of the food manufacturers for compliance of these regulations. What about the Transportation and Innovation Technology Act of 2012? Sounds sort of innocuous, doesn't it? Only Senate Bill 1813 under Section 40304 says that the director of the IRS in this Act of 2012 has the authority to revoke your passport if the IRS believes you are delinquent in your tax debt. There's no due process. You must prove yourself innocent to the IRS to get your passport back. And without a passport, you're a captive slave. I love this. The only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. Otis said, "I will to my dying day oppose with all the powers and faculties God has given me, all the instruments of slavery on the one hand and villainy on the other, as this writs of assistance." They didn't accept this. So neither should we. See, it's not about us. It's about them. Because the regulations and the violations of our rights that we suffer today are the servitudes that they will endure tomorrow. We are not waiting for the return of James Otis Jr. I'm searching for the new one today. Who's going to be James Otis Jr.? Who's going to be James Otis Jr.'s parents that are going to teach the young ones the value of liberty so they will stand?
Boy.
The interesting thing is, Winston Churchill said this: "If you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you may have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival." But he said there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave. I know history and I know how it repeats. And I know the majority of us in this room will never see that final consequence because we are so far from the end of the long train of our abuses. See, as long as the government can figure out they can trickle down just enough stuff to keep us happy subjects, we'll be quietly watching our rights dissolve in front of our eyes. And that long train of abuses will be found by our children and their grandchildren. Here's the thing, though. We don't have to wait now. We can educate. We can liberate. We can be the Otises of today and take a stand so that they don't have to. We can do it peacefully through the power of the state and local governments. We can do it peacefully through our refusal to comply. I don't call it civil disobedience. I call it righteous resistance. Because I'm not being disobedient. It's the government who's being disobedient to the supreme law of the land. It is the spirit of James Otis Jr. It is the spirit of America. And we just got to get reunited with that. Remember where we came from, so we know who we are. This is how you get in touch with me, KrisAnneHall.com. I have a radio show that broadcasts 6 days a week. You can catch the podcast on my website. If you have an iPhone or an Android, you can download my mobile app for free. Then you will have you will not only have all my podcasts, but my assistant will also give you an alert when I'm teaching in the area so that you won't miss any future classes, because I teach a number of classes. As a matter of fact, I am going to be teaching in this general area until the 20th. So I'll be in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania teaching, I think, almost every single day between now and the 20th. And so there are a number of classes that I will be teaching. One of the classes that I'll be teaching, I think, at least 2 times in the next 10 days is a class that I call Restoring the Constitutional Republic. It's the design of the Constitutional Republic as a solution to when the federal government gets out of control. Once again, not my opinion or my interpretations, but the very instructions of the people who gave us our constitutional republic on how to get the federal government out of control. How many would you like to know how to get the federal government under control? Without raising arms, right? Well, they gave us a plan, and so that is available. I also have the book on the table, Sovereign Duty, which teaches that plan if you're not able to make it to the class. I have this book. How many of you know we're not teaching the proper history to our children? Okay. So I have this book, Colton. Show them the blue book, please. This is my son, Colton. These two books are for our young people. The blue book is for non-readers, like that little one right there. It's a read-to-me book. And as she grows up, she can memorize the poems in the chapter, so she'll learn the lessons of liberty that she's supposed to learn. This book is for everybody who's an independent reader. Raise your hand if you can read. I say that because it's got a picture of high school students on it, but I have lots of adults who buy this book. This teaches the 700 years of history that it took to write our Constitution. There are 5, remember the 5 documents I told you about, those liberty charters? I teach you about those 5 liberty charters and how they became our Constitution. And when you hear that history, you cannot deny that history always repeats, because we're repeating it very precisely today. I also have a book over there. Colton, hold up the Liberty First book, please. This book is called Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America. Let me give you a little pop quiz, and you'll see whether you need this book or not. Everybody ready? Don't answer out loud. And don't lip sync the answer, because I don't want your neighbor cheating off you. Got it? All right. There are 5 liberties in the First Amendment. To yourself and not out loud, name all 5 liberties. If you've been paying attention, I said them like 12 times today. But see, I come to you from Florida. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took this poll, found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. I've been asking this question across the country for 5 years now. 2% is a generous estimate. Most of Americans cannot name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment. But if you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? That's what the Liberty First, Path to Restoring America book is all about. It not only teaches you what those 5 liberties are, but teaches you how to exercise them on a daily basis with practical everyday suggestions. Because here's the thing. If you are not exercising your rights daily, they're already gone. Because the only way you secure your rights is by exercising them. So if we don't know what they are, we know we're not exercising them, right? The Sovereign Duty book is the one that I told you about. We're teaching the class this week. Colton, hold up the Sovereign Duty book, please. I also, from this book, teach a class to state legislators. I have taught a class to state legislators in over 8 states already. One of those is Oregon. And I'm figuring if I can teach the legislators of Oregon on the constitutional responsibility of the sovereignty of the state, don't you think I should be able to do that here in New Jersey?
They need it.
Well, here's how that works. You have to arrange it, and I will come and do it. I have over 10 different classes. I teach high school, middle school students. I teach 96-year-olds. I'll teach any group, anywhere. It doesn't matter the political affiliation or the ideology, because I am about liberty. I am about the Constitution. I am not about politics. How many of you know the Constitution is not political? Or at least it shouldn't be anyway. And all you have to do is contact me on my website and ask me to come. I have no speaking fees. I don't make any groups compensate me for our travel or our expenses. This is a labor of love. We believe that we are paying back our founders, our fortune and sacred honor. We are also Christians. We believe that liberty is a gift from God, so we have a duty to stand for what God has given us. Now, in spite of the rumors, I am not independently wealthy, nor have I ever received a dime from the Koch brothers or George Soros. But if they want to fund me, my message won't change. But here's the deal. The point of this is not to glorify myself, but to just simply point out that it won't cost you a dime to spread this education. But what's it costing our future to remain ignorant? And that's why we do this, because I want him to have liberty without fighting for it. So I want to thank you guys for bringing me here today and giving me the opportunity to speak. And I ask a couple favors. First, please pray for us. We are on the road, 265 classes in 22 states every year. We are also missionaries to Haiti. The village that we serve was nearly completely destroyed. We had some people in our village were killed in the Hurricane Matthew, and the only standing structure in our village is the church and community center that we built there for them, and they sought shelter in there, and now they're still seeking shelter in there. It's now become a place where we can pass out food. We have cisterns for them to have water. But we'd ask you to pray for us and help and support us in that mission to Haiti in any way that you can. We'd also ask you to leave different than you came in the door. I am sure in this particular room, there are some highly educated people on liberty. My only hope is that I have given you something new today, and that you will take that something new and share it with someone else. So thank you guys, everybody, for your time. Please see where we're going to be this week. How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been here with you today? Yeah? So invite them to come along. So maybe you got to drive an hour, but I'll just remind you, I came from Florida. Yeah, that's a little guilt trip. I'm a mom. I can do those things, right? So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And I'll look forward to seeing you guys.